Welcome everyone, my name is Joseph Mikett. I'm the Director of the Energy Security and Climate Program here at CSIS. To those who are joining us online, you're most welcome to participate in today's event. There's a little box at the below there that you should be able to lob questions at us, and we've got tools to read those here for our esteemed panelists. It is Earth Day. Funny enough, that's a coincidence that we scheduled today's event on Earth Day, but I'm very excited for this conversation to start what I think is going to be a long conversation here in Washington, around the world, about what is the nature of international climate effort going to be? One sense is an incredible shift in the vibe. President Trump has returned to office, immediately pulled the United States again out of the Paris Climate Agreement, to a lot less stated concern than we saw the first time. And I'm not sure if that's a harbinger of a more fundamental change, where maybe the world is going to start backing away from a lot of its previous climate ambition, or if it's a recognition that the world can do this without the United States. And I'd love to explore that and other questions with this group. Please let me introduce them very briefly. Mario Loyola, immediately on my left, is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He served in the first Trump administration at the Council of Environmental Quality and holds an academic position at Florida International University. Sarah Ladislaw is a managing director at the Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI. Formerly worked for the Biden administration on the National Security Council, and before all that, sat in this seat here at CSIS for just a couple of years. And on the very end, David Victor, professor at UCSD, non-resident fellow here at CSIS, and one of the country's top experts on the politics and geopolitics of climate. So welcome all, and thank you for being here. Mario, maybe we can start with you. As our sort of on-stage conservative, there's been this huge change. The Secretary of Energy talks about zero energy poverty, not net zero emissions. We've seen multiple people refer to net zero, which is one of the kind of the fundamental developments that came from the Paris Climate Agreement, not just as impractical, but sinister. Can you give us a sense of what is underlying these comments and where you think the policy world is going here in Washington?
So thank you, Joe, and thank you for having me at CSIS. So I think, Greta Thunberg likes to talk about this existential crisis facing the planet. And, the risk from climate change may be serious, but talking about it as an existential crisis is maybe not intentionally, a kind of a rhetorical trick, because it gets the speaker off the hook of having to do cost-benefit analysis, right? Is this policy, the policies that we're proposing, are they going to hurt more people than they're going to help in the long run? What I think is underlying a lot of some of the vibe shift, to the extent it's more real than apparent, is maybe a little bit of more confidence on the part of, say, people in the Trump administration, that the costs of the Paris-style top-down decarbonization are increasingly obvious to increasingly large numbers of people. And this becomes really obvious when you go to the COP and you see the people from the global south who are there, ministers of energy from India, from countries that are at significant risk of climate change, saying we are not going to sacrifice human development in our countries for decarbonization. Even here in the United States, it's clear that let's take the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies for wind and solar, are having a really toxic impact on the electricity grid, because they're discouraging investment in other sources, like natural gas, nuclear, that we actually need to maintain grid stability. We can get into that a little bit more. But I think if in Trump 1, I think the Trump White House was pretty sure that the Paris Agreement was not worth the cost that it would be imposing on society, and now they are 100% sure.
I don't want to reside too long on the Paris Agreement, because I think the questions we should address are much larger. But I do think it's worthy of a little bit more discussion, in part because it's approaching 10 years on. And in that 10-year period, it seems like climate has had pretty profound cultural and economic impacts. We saw a lot of development, and yet we saw of policy models and technology, and yet you saw countries serially underperforming on emissions reductions and pushing of the goals. David, you've been both a critic and a purveyor of alternative models. What is your sense of where we stand with the COP and the Paris Agreement and where things may be going?
Yeah, I was pretty critical the first couple of decades of international cooperation on climate because I think it actually had many flavors that Mario's critical of. It was centralized, top-down, targets and timetables attached to the back of the Kyoto Protocol. That never struck me as workable because they were rigid, because they were legally binding, and therefore countries were going to make sure they complied, and therefore they were going to make sure the targets actually were, for most countries, easy to meet. And that's not what creates investment in innovation and testing and things like that. I actually have a very different view of Paris. I think Paris is about as good as it gets. It's a flexible framework. It's a binding umbrella. You go to these meetings and people have all kinds of claims, but I live in a university. You go to university meetings, people have all kinds of claims, such as life. Some of the claims are hyperbolic and unachievable, huge compensation programs and so on. That's not going to happen.
Whereas at think tanks, everything is completely objective.
I left you to connect the dots. So thank you for doing that. It seems to me that the smart part about Paris is it lets individual countries say, here's what we're going to do. It created some perverse incentives to announce things that were never going to be achievable. Net zero was not achievable. I'm not sure it's sinister. People say all kinds of things that are not achievable. The 2-degree goal was never achievable. 1.5 degrees is not achievable. So this time around, when the Trump administration left Paris on day one, I think one of the changes in the mood is that we've seen the movie before. This movie, the new movie's running much faster than the old movie. But we've seen the movie before. Other countries kind of know what it means to still be in. But at the same time, there's a lot more thinking around the world on these issues of cost-benefit. And there's a lot more attention to the unachievability of many of these goals. And I guess two last comments on this. Because of that, we're going to see a lot of firms and governments blink. Yep. They're going to stare at these goals. They're going to need to blink. I put out a piece from the World Economic Forum last fall on how to blink responsibly. What can you do? I couldn't believe that they let me get away with that title. I don't think that it translated into Swiss, German, and French quite the way I thought it did, but whatever. And so you want firms and government to say, hey, this is not achievable, but this is what we're doing, this is responsible, and also this is what's politically sustainable. And that leads to my last comment, which is what's our theory of change? The theory of change in international cooperation on climate change is not some global committee that tells everybody what to do. That doesn't work, requires centralizing too much information, and we've run the experiment, it failed. Instead, it's about creating incentives to go run experiments, test stuff at scale, figure out what works, what it costs, and so on, and then replicate that around the world. And so you create these technological revolutions and new industries and new jobs, not by centralized mandate, but by showing how it's done and then getting a lot of followership, not just leadership. And in that sense, I think actually the Paris, if you think about Paris that way, the framework is about as good as you can get when it's negotiated by consensus in a global committee.
Sarah, you were in the Biden administration. You were at the heart of trying to run some of those experiments. Right? How do we establish clean energy supply chains to connect decarbonization to economic productivity, to security? You've worked with other countries on that question. That's a lot of the work you've been driving at RMI. What is your sense of how those are going? Like, what are we learning that's working?
Yeah, I mean, quite a bit actually, but maybe just to take a small step back, which I think that my observation about energy and climate is that we have a tendency to do a lot of stuff and try like a particular paradigm for a while until we don't anymore, right? Like that's always sort of been true. And that's just, I think, the moment in time we're in right now, which is we had even within sort of like the post-Paris environment, which is I always like find it funny when we go back to Paris as like a paradigm because I think
post-Paris.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, the day I stop doing post-Paris like talks will be fantastic because like I think we've been so post-Paris for a long period of time that anyway, I think there's been a number of iterations since then, which is there was a period in time a long time ago where just proving that you could have an energy system that is more integrated, more digitized, with different types of and and rely on a lot of different types of energy sources,
Yep.
like was sort of a thing we thought, but it wasn't necessarily true, right? There was a time where we thought that a huge amount of our power could come from nuclear, and it wasn't true until it was, you know? And so like I think that this experimentation dynamic is just continually what we're doing, not just on a technology level, but on a policy level as well. And so what I observe over the last, say, 5 years is it became pretty evident that doing a large-scale clean energy transition only for the purposes of climate was unsatisfying, right? We had left that period where it was like, yeah, let's do this for the purposes of the climate. And there was a moment where that was very animating for lots of countries and companies and politicians and investors. But we have been coming out of that for a period of time where it was like, it costs money. We're dropping the cost of some technology, and we're integrating more and more different kinds of technologies. And we have additional and even higher hopes for things like decarbonized hydrogen that we just wouldn't have conceived of, 5 years ago. So there's a reality that clean energy is now a large investable market that we have to think about how you incorporate into energy systems at a cost and a rate and pace that is not just acceptable to the people who bear the cost for that, but also for all of our hopes and dreams about what it delivers in terms of that energy system. I actually think that is where we've been and why you've seen so much industrial strategy oriented to climate. That plus the pandemic has created this giant learning journey across the world for people who had no literal idea where anything they purchased came from, to really understanding that more now and trying to figure out what do we care about? Like, what do we actually need to have more control over versus not? And while we think we say those terms all the time, right? We need to have more control over supply chains. We need to reindustrialize. All of this stuff is now sitting on the back of energy and climate policy. It's all the same stuff. But we are not yet, where you asked where are we experimenting and learning, we as a global community know how to purchase those things and integrate those things in different ways. We don't all know how to invent them. We certainly don't all know how to manufacture them, nor do we have like a really solid idea of how much we need to be inventing and manufacturing ourselves. Right. But all of this is on the back of how do you have a strong economy with a growing and thriving society that is able to deal with all the things that climate change is going to bring to you. For me, that is the most accurate representation of the discussion that I was having when I was in government and the discussions that we have with people now, which I think is, I think we are still kind of evolutionarily kind of trying to figure out what is the name for that, what the global architecture is for that. But I think that, to me, is at least the place where we're now all currently experimenting, which has huge implications for cost-benefit analysis in terms of building out a clean energy system or an energy system.
Well, now that we've achieved full consensus on all these issues,
we're good. Well, I guess that's the question, is like, what costs and benefits does that add to the equation? So suddenly you're saying, well, I'm developing this technological pathway because I'm going to benefit from access to a global marketplace. Is it, or I'm going to improve my energy security, right? Like the story of Europe over the last few years was the catastrophe that came after they lost gas access from Europe. And it was LNG, but also rapid deployment of renewables and grid balancing technologies that allowed them to weather that crisis.
So they're not out of the woods yet.
No, clearly. The long-term costs imposed by this are totally unsustainable. But go ahead, David.
Jimmy, one of the implications of this is you often don't know in the beginning, and it's unknowable. You don't know which technologies are going to pan out, especially the more disruptive and transformational. Take hydrogen. For a long time, people thought hydrogen was going to be the solution for essentially all the non-electric approaches. That's overstatement, but not too much. And now there's all kinds of troubles in hydrogen, partly because people went too gaga on green hydrogen, and electrolyzer costs didn't come down, and we didn't have enough a balanced portfolio with other ways of making hydrogen. And also, a lot of the technologies haven't panned out. And so there was one whole set of visions that might yet come to pass, but haven't really panned out in the way people originally thought. And solar and wind, many countries have learned about the dangers of having too much intermittent renewable power on their grids, the value of clean, firm power. Now we've got experimentation going on with deep geothermal. Will that work? Won't it work? I don't know. All kinds of cool stuff is happening now on the nuclear side. And so it's kind of unknowable in the beginning. But I think this perspective that Sarah mentioned is really important, because as you run these experiments, you also figure out what other interest groups want those technologies to succeed, where the costs come down, where the performance excels. And so the cost-benefit analysis from the beginning of this process looks catastrophic for all the new technologies because they look ridiculously expensive. And then as you start to advance, some of them come into the money, they get political allies, and that theory of political change, that's what we're beginning to see. And one last comment on this, which is the Bloomberg New Energy Finance data that come out in the first quarter of every year, this year really instructive, because here you continue to see year-on-year growth in investment in clean industry, and it depends exactly on how you define that, more than $2 trillion a year. And then this complete bifurcation. In the sectors where the business models are mature, so renewables, electric power grids, electric vehicles, some of the servicing for EV infrastructure and so on, you see year-on-year rapid growth in investment. And the sectors where the technologies are not mature, hydrogen, some of the advanced chemistry work, and so on, we actually saw for the first time in the last decade or so a year-on-year decline in investment. So you've got this bifurcation, and that reflects the politics and the business models. Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think before everyone gets the impression that we all agree about all this stuff, let me just say that let me just flesh out, what I think is maybe an area of disagreement, maybe not actually. But the Inflation Reduction Act's solar and wind tax credits, we've had solar and wind tax credits in this country for a long time. They keep getting renewed every couple of years. But the Inflation Reduction Act really took these things to a whole new level. We don't know when it's going to sunset because it's tied to emissions targets. So this could be $1 trillion program, $1.5 trillion program, and these subsidies are result. If you look at I would just advise everyone to look at the North American Electrical Reliability Corporation, the grid, which operates the bulk electricity system in North America. Look at their last long-term reliability report that they published in December. They don't like picking political fights. They're trying to say it as nicely as possible. But this tsunami of solar and wind that's been added to the grid and is getting added to the grid at an accelerating rate is making it increasingly difficult and even impossible for the grid operators to manage the grid reliably. If you look at the interconnection queue, and it all depends on your point of, I think it shouldn't depend on your point of view because depends on how broad your lens is. You look at the interconnection queue. The interconnection queue is the projects that are lining up that want interconnection to the grid in 2 years or 3 years. It's usually you need a preliminary agreement in order to get your permit in many cases to build the project. There is more solar capacity on the interconnection queue lining up for interconnection than the entire aggregate grid capacity, generation capacity of the United States. That looks nice, but most of this stuff is never going to get built. And what is missing from the interconnection queue is everything else, right? So there's no nuclear on the interconnection queue now. There is very little natural gas on the interconnection queue, and coal power is disappearing. And so if you think about just honing in on this, what is the problem? Adding solar and wind is great if the economics work out, if they can compete on a cost basis with other sources. But when investors look at the fact that all this solar is getting dumped on the grid in the middle of the day and they can't recoup their costs, this is why, even though demand forecasts are soaring and construction in all kinds of power plants should be booming, there's no construction in power plants in the United States now, only solar plants, right? And battery projects and some wind. And so that is a really big problem because if you factor in the average availability of a solar plant, which is only 24% of its nominal capacity on average in the United States, and then the fact that it can't even be counted on to deliver that much power when needed, In nominal numbers, the grid looks like it's expanding, but actually it's contracting in terms of what NERC calls projected power availability. And it's contracting in the face of demand that is soaring faster than has ever been recorded. And that starts looking like an energy crisis. This is why electricity prices have risen 30% in the last 5 years. And the capacity markets are spiking in PJM. This is why PJM got itself into a fight with Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania recently when it said, yes, we've got a tsunami of solar applications lined up. We can't take any more solar in the PJM area. We need other sources of power because we can't manage a grid like this. And just one more point on this. This is in the United States, right, where we've discovered, consider this. The United States has discovered, most people don't know this, but operating a grid on the basis of natural gas, which is the big transition that resulted in much lower carbon emissions for the grid in the United States over the past 15 years, the transition from coal to natural gas, operating a grid on the basis of natural gas is much, much, much more complicated than operating a grid on the basis of coal power, right? Because coal power, you can just stack up the coal next to the power plant, burn it when you need it. Natural gas is a national system that has to have natural gas constantly in the pipelines at constant pressure. This almost exceeds the administrative capacity of the United States, which has regulators that can regulate almost anything. Solar and wind and battery is a whole level of complexity beyond that. Now think about Africa and sustainable development, right? Even getting those countries to transition from coal to natural gas is an impossible administrative hurdle. Expecting them to be able to do this clean energy transition from the beginning, I think is really fantastical and really risk depriving them of things that those societies need to flourish.
I guess, there are some differences of views here. I'm less paralyzed by this problem. Yeah, there's a lot of solar coming on in the grid, but grid operators are recognizing these reliability problems, as are the companies that are on the front lines of this, and that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of solar projects stack up in the interconnection queue. We're going to need to have a whole reform of the interconnection queue system. The interconnection queue system originally was designed so that you had real projects lining up to get real interconnection. Now you have vapor projects here and there on the supply side and on the demand side, as has been widely discussed with the data centers. And the queue system is not helping the market reveal what's valuable and what's not valuable. Right. Meanwhile, let's take Edison, Southern California Edison. So this is a California electric company. They put out this report last September during Earth Week in New York, where they said, we want to make big reductions in emissions. California law requires us to go to zero in 2045. Who knows? California in the 1990s was going to go to net zero vehicles, and everyone thought it was going to be hydrogen or electric or whatever it is. None of that worked out, so they changed the rules. But they said, we are concerned about reliability. So what's the core conclusion of the report? Yeah, we're going to put a lot of renewables on the grid, but we better keep our gas plants there and available. And so we're now seeing gas plants dispatched less, but playing a bigger role in reliability. We saw, exactly as you say, the PJM, the organized market in the northeastern part of the most of the northeastern part of the United States, having a capacity auction that actually delivered prices that encourage people to build capacity. I take all that as evidence that the system is starting to work. I'm deeply concerned about high power prices. I'm concerned about that because it affects low-income households, and frankly, it affects the politics of all this. If power prices go up and reliability goes sideways or down, that's a disaster for the clean energy transition, and the clean energy transition will suffer, and we're seeing some evidence of that.
Right. Not to mention just like general social welfare, which is the purpose of all.
Oh, there's that too. Yes.
Right. Yeah, I agree that the information content of the queue is less than we would like. I don't think it's true that we're exclusively building solar and wind, though I think there's a lot more of it. The one question I think is interesting is right now the price of a gas turbine has doubled or maybe even close to tripled as we try to meet this growing demand, right? And that's reflecting that those are sort of supply limited. We only have so much manufacturing capacity for gas turbines in the United States or globally.
Although the manufacturers are expanding, there are places you can get. They're
Right.
trying.
Yeah. And I wonder how much that is a symptom of long-term expectations of energy transition versus a statement about economics? And I actually don't know. I would love to try and think about that question a little bit, but maybe some of our colleagues have thought about it.
I mean, well, maybe just a couple of thoughts, which is I think that what we are finding is it is very hard for us to build anything. And I know that is literally the most cliche thing to say in Washington right now, but it is extremely hard for us to build things, transmission lines, power plants, even the cost for solar and wind and batteries and things that have consistently come down are sort of going back up again on a project cost basis. So we have a problem, which is we are facing a period in time where we know we're going to have to grow the capability and the capacity of the electric power sector in the United States to meet what we want to do, okay? We have mixed incentive systems that don't send the right signals to people. We've got these long interconnection queues. We have sort of mixed ideas about the right pathway to get to reliability. And quite frankly, it is extremely hard for me to talk about these things in abstract because the United States has very particular problems in very particular areas. And then globally, there are very particular issues in very particular places. And so I think what I find myself repeatedly having to come back to is the grid itself can work in many, many different ways, and we can overcome the complexity of that. I believe I have a sort of techno-optimist viewpoint in that. But we don't have that grid today. That grid doesn't exist here. It doesn't exist in most places. And so if we want to make that happen, we have to be a little more conscientious about the energy transition that we want to undertake here in the US. The thing that I'm feeling relatively decent about this day and age is that isn't fundamentally about climate. It is about making energy affordable, and it is making all of the things we want to invest in from a strategic standpoint actually happen. I think what the danger is for us to get in supply side conversations about that are not fundamentally about how do you make the system that is designed to get assets to places work in more functional ways, in more appropriate, appropriate ways in terms of the demand signals. I think that we need to do what a lot of what I hear coming out of this administration, which is thinking about dropping costs through permitting and siting, thinking about the ways in which we regulate the electric power sector, both at a federal level and at a state and local level, and think about the time we're in, which is genuinely different, right? We are going to have growing electric power demand expectations that are fundamentally mismatched with the speed that our system can shift at, right? So that is a different problem. We should solve for that problem. I think that there's probably a place for all the generation we could possibly throw at it, given what we think is likely going to happen on the demand side. I also think we're probably, if we know anything about new industries, we're probably wrong on the demand side too. So I want us to be careful in the sense that I do think we should think about if we want the grid to be more functional and we want it to expand in its capacity, what do we need to do to make it do that? And I think that there's actual lots of stuff to be done in that space. And I think not so much of it is on the supply side. Some of it's on the supply side, maybe on the permitting and siting of things, but I think if the market saw a pathway to adding generation that could be functional for all of the needs of that generation in a grid that was able to recognize that sort of operational structure, I think we would be able to get around this issue. And I don't think it means saying yes or no to solar and wind with battery capacity, or yes to coal and natural gas. I think it's about in those regional transmission organizations and those regional planning markets, what is it the thing that they can do to get to that solution?
For a list of potential solutions, interested readers should visit the Powerline blog here at CSIS, as well as our recent paper on unlocking AI's potential through electricity reforms. Go ahead, Mario.
So you wanted to respond to this. I mean, I think when I was at Council on Environmental Quality in the Trump White House, the first time around, we were focused on permitting reform. Right. And I would say The attitudes towards renewable energy in that Trump administration ranged from nostalgic, ranged from indifferent to agnostic to hostile. But if you didn't know which administration was Democrat and which was Republican over the last decade, and you just saw the amount of solar and wind capacity that was getting permitted, let's just take Bureau of Land Management as an example, you'd be hard-pressed to figure out which was the Republican and which was the Democrat, right? Yep. And if you look at the Biden administration's solar plan, the one that they put out, I think, a year ago, for managing solar development on BLM land in the West, 11 states. This is like an anti-solar plan, right? It put all kinds of conditions on solar development that didn't exist before. It cut by more than half the amount of land in the West that was eligible for development in solar projects. And a cool lighting, I like that.
Not enough solar.
I'll just say what this is responding to is the political reality on the ground, right? I mean, the Princeton Net Zero study calls for 500 gigawatts of solar capacity to meet net zero. That's like an area the size of New Jersey covered in solar panels. And the reason why we have the permitting hurdles that we have in this country is because the system serves a very important function, which is to give voice to local interests that are affected. What was driving Secretary Haaland's development of this BLM solar plant? It's a bunch of people in Nevada who don't want solar near where they live, right? And so these concentrated, it's the same public choice problem that we see in so many other policy areas, where concentrated special interest group defeat what would be in everyone's favor if people just knew, or as Milton Friedman said, we're all more concerned in our role as a producer of one thing than as in our role as a consumer of 1,000 things. And that's how the public interest has nobody representing it on Capitol Hill or in the administration. And so these public choice problems are very serious. And I would say, but the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, the effect of that on investment in the power sector is such that even if we got our entire wish list of permitting reform, which is impossible because because of opposition from environmental advocacy groups would make that impossible. But let's say that they had a change of heart and sold out on, just completely bought into renewable energy, and we got our whole wish list, you still would have no investment in abundant natural gas and these other capacities because of the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies.
I just don't think it's factually correct that there's no investment in natural gas power generation in the United States. Like there's been a massive surge in it, which is why getting the turbines ordered is really difficult. I think that I take your point sort of separate from that, but I think that there's probably, and we need to be specific about the Biden solar plan, this Inflation Reduction Act solar incentive, if you're talking about the investment tax credit sort of versus sort of the production side. There's lots of policies that go to deploying solar that is in the Inflation Reduction Act. I think if you talk to most utilities and you talk to folks that are investing in power generation infrastructure that allows for more distributed options or even utility scale options, that solar has provided a pathway to affordability that didn't exist in those other technologies. Not necessarily because there was something blocking those other technologies, but because just on a cost comparative basis, it just performed better. And so I'm pretty okay with it just performing better. I think that there's a fundamental question that we need to answer on solar that is slightly different, which is, why do we need to produce it here? And how much of it do we need to produce here? And what does that do about the cost of it? And how do you add it to a grid? What does it need to be complemented with if you think that the battery plus storage application you're thinking about for a given jurisdiction doesn't add to the sort of resilience or reliability criteria piece? So I think that there's lots of questions about it. I'm not sure that there was a direction in which the Inflation Reduction Act took a very large amount of capital that was searching the world for a destination and landed it in the United States of America. And that was by design. That was the design of the written that many, many times. The design of the program was to crowd in private capital to the U.S. to build out not just the deployment of clean energy, but also the manufacturing and production of it. And so I think I don't think we can say with a straight face that the Inflation Reduction Act did not affect the capital flow into the energy space over, a period of time. But quite frankly, there was a lot of, CCUS has seen a huge uptick, which was designed to make more opportunity for coal and solar, coal and natural gas and other sort of hydrocarbon-based applications. There's a huge amount of investment. I mean, we're sitting in the ExxonMobil room. ExxonMobil's put a ton of capital towards those things because of those tax credits. So I do think that there's sort of it has skewed the capital flow only to one thing, not to mention if you just look at why the solar market is doing what it's doing globally, the Inflation Reduction Act is important, but not that important. So I just think that there's a bigger, broader story there.
Yeah, let me actually, I want to return a little bit to the question of sort of where we are going climate-wise. And Sarah's comment raises this question of net zero as a goal, in part because net zero is an inclusive language, technologically speaking, right? It creates opportunities for carbon capture. Lots of Republicans have supported carbon capture for years. When he was the governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum had a great carbon capture and management plan for that state. But it is it's like what our colleague Kevin Book calls a because technology. There aren't a lot of reasons to do the carbon capture process unless you're concerned about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You can buy, if you need CO2, you can buy cheaper elsewhere. And it is going to be, if you ever deployed it in a true net zero scenario, a very, very expensive thing for the world to do. Is it important in a Washington that is moving away from net zero that we are losing that sort of tech inclusivity when we talk about all the things we invest in terms of DOE innovation, loan programs office deployments? What?
It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem because, net zero is not what makes the politics glue together. It just reminds me of those old Dow 36,000 discussions. Yeah, it'll get to 36,000 as long as you don't tell me the date. So we have to be at net zero ultimately in some geologic sense if we're going to stop climate. But that's not what creates the political allies here. One of the great things about CSIS is that it gets a whole industry that otherwise could be hostile, indifferent to hostile, around action on climate, and gets them focused on how do we do projects that generate jobs and also play a role in dispatchable power and LNG projects with lower footprints and so on. So I think that's all good for the politics. And to the extent that a mixture of uncertainty about the Inflation Reduction Act or rollback or its exclusion in reconciliation and chaos, quite apart from the policy environment, chaos in a capital-intensive business is terrible because it raises risk. And so you see all these projects that are on hold right now just because of the policy chaos, the capital markets chaos, and so on. You put all that together, that's not good for the long term. But it also means that the political alliances around these clean tech, the political alliances get weaker and more ephemeral, and that's bad for the long-term aspiration here.
When I hear political alliances, I think again of public choice issues. Mario.
Yeah, two quick points on some of what we just heard. So first of all, the Biden Clean Power Plan was basically focused on requiring large new baseload, combined cycle natural gas plants to reduce 90-something% or nearly all their carbon emissions through carbon capture and storage.
Right.
Nobody in the industry, to my knowledge, or very few people, were planning to build a power plant that would have been subject to this rule. What they were planning to do was build power plants that would not be subject to the rule and avoid the triggering thresholds, right? So to the extent that this,
what you mean by that is build a natural gas plant that's going to run at low capacity factors.
Right. Which by the way is what you need. What you need when you have a lot of intermittent sources is you need peaker plants, right? They're much more carbon intensive than combined cycle plants. They're much smaller, but this is why if you look at the number, you see a lot of activity that these smaller plants are being built. I think that these are simple cycle combustion cycle plants that are being built. But when you look again at the NERC, this responds to your point, when you look at NERC's sort of summary of here's the capacity that we've added in the United States in 2024, the reason why you see so little natural gas is that the natural gas that's being built is canceling out the natural gas. The smaller plants that are being built are canceling out the larger plants that are being retired. And that's why the aggregate build out of natural gas last year barely canceled out barely made up for the retirements of nuclear. And what you are really seeing is a massive build out of solar and a massive retirement of coal. That's what's happening on the electricity grid of the United States. And none of these grid operators want to say coal, so they use the phrase thermal to be polite. They use the phrase thermal power, right? Because they would love it for all of it to be nuclear, right? We would all love for all of this stuff to be nuclear. But they're worried that they can't operate the grid on the basis of all of this solar that's being added. Anyway, that's those 2 quick points.
So that's exactly what you'd expect, right? So we have a lot of non-dispatchable power on the grid. And so, yeah, volumetrically, gas looks flat. But in terms of the value to the grid of that gas, the value of the grid has gone up.
Colleagues in the audience, we're going to have a chance to hear questions from you all in just 1 minute, but I want to close on one issue. Sarah, you talked about the question of, what do we want to build here versus what do we want to build elsewhere, that being a driving consideration for a lot of the last administration. I think it will be a driving consideration for this administration. Supply chain security across a wide variety of things is clearly an issue that they want to work on. They want to see manufacturing in the United States for cultural, aesthetic reasons as much as security reasons. And we are, kind of overwhelmed with the idea that we're in a more geopolitical world. If Paris was the result of a kind of cooperative age, and we're now entering an age that I don't know if you would call it realist, if you would call it geopolitical. I'm not certain.
I think chaos is the word.
Chaos, globally, not just domestically.
The Joker age.
Yeah, what's the path forward for climate cooperation in that context? And is it going to be a series of bilateral deals where we're trying to trade technologies with India and with Japan and trying to navigate a fraught relationship with China?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I think maybe a couple things. I spent the last 2 years and spent more time, all the way back to what I was here at CSIS. The reason I find climate change particularly interesting, I'm an international affairs background person, is it is such an amazing, strategic issue for the world to grapple with, right? And what's been interesting over the last few years is that people have decided, because very large economies in the world have invested in clean energy technologies in ways that, you might not think we get to net zero, but you probably don't think they go away either.
Right.
Now, it isn't a question of do you believe in doing something in these new technology spaces? It is the most capitalized and capable countries in the world are all investing in these technologies.
Right.
They are the future of the global economy. So make a choice. Do you want to be in that race or do you not? Because we're not winning. So we could try to participate in those terms, and there are really good climate spillover benefits. I hate to break it to everyone, even if we got to net zero, we haven't really solved all the stuff that comes along with dealing with climate change. So we have a lot to deal with on the climate cooperatism point. So I just think that there's another way to look at this, which is there's change happening. Some of it is about those specific technologies. Some of it is about the markets and the way we organize those technologies. And some of it is about the digital capability and technologies of the future that we think are going to inform and then embed in those technologies and power forward. All of that is going on at the same time in our energy and climate conversations. So if we don't take it from that landscape, we miss all the highly consequential conversations going on around the world right now that don't look like an NDC dialogue.
Right.
But they're absolutely going to be extremely important for deciding what the content of the energy systems around the globe look like. They're going to be done in trade negotiations. They're going to be done in technology agreements, in bilateral investment. I think this is where what David said about being competitive to attract capital in a way that allows people to take on the long-lived capital assets. If you want a nuclear future, let's go for it. But man, we have a lot of work to do to make people think that that's a future that they can have here in the United States, right, or one that we're going to be investing in seriously abroad. Like that type of certainty is the type of thing that is the most interesting about climate conversations right now, because they're not really about climate. They're about the competitiveness of your economy in a future where we're not feeling like we all want to just get along and sort of co-design an outcome. We definitely are. I think we're at sort of like just a recalibration moment on a lot of bigger topics than sort of just climate. And that is going to be the nature of how climate conversations like get carried out, at least for the next couple of years. They may not look a lot like climate conversations, but we've kind of been there before. They're going to look like, how are you investing in your energy system, and what is the net result of that, and what do you think what do you need in terms of your own supply chains? What technologies do you think you can be competitive in? And I think that the major concern that I have is that I think the US should participate in all of those conversations, both from an industrial capability perspective, but also in a multilateral negotiation perspective, because those conversations will happen with or without us. We are not essential to that recipe anymore.
David, is it accurate that if the US withdraws from these conversations, the whole world is just going to go on without us?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't erase all the other problems in the world. The climate diplomacy, the formal diplomacy, you asked about cooperation, we're moving more and more into a world where cooperation happens tacitly. It happens by folks going out and creating new industries, driving down the cost of technology, and then demonstrating that's credible, and that happens in a variety of other places, and then capital floods into that. It doesn't happen because some global committee gets together and says, thou shalt put capital in this location, because so much is about credibility and the business model. So when you host one of these big climate conferences, you have to do the formal conference where there's a formal agreement, a consensus agreement, and so on. And then you do things on the side that demonstrate what you care about. So the Brazilians are going to do a bunch of stuff about land use on the side and a handful of other topics. That could be quite valuable. I do expect one of these years we're going to have a climate conference that fails, because the agenda includes a bunch of things, including financial transfers that are just not viable. And you got a lot of countries that are pissed off, and they're going to take the ball and go home, just like they did in Copenhagen in 2009. And I think that's going to be very interesting, because there it's going to be very important, if it happens in Brazil, it'll be very important for the Brazilians, and I assume the Australians, the follow-on hosts, to figure out, what do you do? How do you demonstrate that there are parts of this that are still credible, so that you don't end up accidentally blowing the whole thing up? And just last comment, I get the Trump people don't want to be in. That was clear on day one. Everyone expected that was going to happen on day one. Frankly, I think it's better to have them out if they're not going to participate in a constructive way than it is to be in, but upset at everyone. It's like inviting a skunk to the garden party. And there will be a lot of complaints about the Trump administration in Brazil this year. Formally, there'll still be a member. So there's kind of this awkward period where they in principle could be in some unusual coalitions blocking things. It's very easy to cause trouble for consensus global diplomacy. But at the end of the day, that's an important institution because it creates legitimacy for the effort, but it's not the engine. Right. The engine is facts on the ground, projects that work, things that have political allies inside key countries.
Yeah, and for institutional design, those interested should read David's book with Charlie Sable,
or just buy it.
Yeah.
If you don't read it. Just buy it.
You don't have to read
You don't care if they read it.
Once it's purchased, I mean, I go to the library, I don't care.
No, buy it.
Let's turn to the audience. There should be a mic runner. If anybody's got a question, please do introduce yourself and where you come from, and recall that a question has a brief propositional statement followed by a sentence which goes up at the end.
Hi. That's fine. That's fine. Hi, Travis Brubaker at E3G. So the conversation has focused a lot on mitigation. I was wondering what adaptation looks like in a post-squared Paris world. When I talk with governments, especially across the Indo-Pacific, maybe they don't care so much about mitigation technology transfers, especially smaller countries, but the adaptation is very important. Thanks.
You want to say something?
You're right.
For the conversation about adaptation has been way too late. I think overall we're making progress on the climate problem. We were on track 15 years ago for 5 or 6 degrees Celsius of warming, now on track for maybe 2.5 or 3. That's progress. That's the way to measure progress. But still, that's a lot of change. And so we're just way too late on this. What I find encouraging about I'll say 2 things about adaptation agenda that I think are encouraging. The first one is that the politics of adaptation are almost the inverse of mitigation. So mitigation, you spend a lot of money today, less money than you thought to before, because technologies improve, that harm some industries that know who they are today, that are organized against that for the beneficiaries that are mostly in the future, mostly in other countries. And so it's not surprising that it's taken a while. Adaptation is the opposite. Whether or not you think humans cause this or whatever, the climate's changing, and you have to deal with it. And the benefits of dealing with it accrue locally in the form of infrastructure and jobs and investment and so on, and the consequences of not doing it accrue locally. And so in that sense, the politics are more favorable. But the other thing I'll say is we have to figure out how to help the markets work here. The cost numbers with bad adaptation are really astronomical. So we need to let the property and casualty markets see real prices. We need the municipal bond market in this country to see which municipalities are exposed and not exposed. Start getting that stuff priced inside the market. My guess is that there will be a lot of places, not my guess, I know this is happening already. There are a lot of places in the world that are figuring out how to become more resilient. And what makes them resilient is not just capital, but also institutions that can look ahead and plan and so on. And we're going to see a massive shakeout around the world, around the places that have the institutional and market arrangements that allow for resilience, and those that don't. And that's mostly going to be a question of social institutions and not just the physical impacts of climate change. And that variation in resilience will explain most of the variation in who gets hurt the worst.
Mario.
So thank you. So yeah, I mean, adaptation and resilience is what I focus on at Florida International University, and it's obviously what, people in Miami, to the extent they think climate change is a problem, they are not waiting for people in Colorado to start all driving Teslas. They're worried about saltwater intrusion into the aquifer. They're worried about storm surge problems and worsening hurricane damage and all of this. And I think I'll make 2 comments. First of all, at a conceptual level, I teach Clean Air Act within environmental law. And the risk assessment of carbon emissions as a pollutant, in my mind, if you take away all the quasi-religious stuff and end of the planet stuff, it does not point you in the direction of a primary policy response of carbon mitigation. It points you in the direction of adaptation and resilience because, as is the case with other pollutants, the populations that are at risk are localized, right? And the people where I've lived for many years in Miami are at much greater risk of climate change than people in Colorado, say, right? And so what populations are at risk where is why, and then this is why the politics align properly, and then you get away from, because there could be natural drivers of the climate that we're not even detecting in the assessments, right? And so this way, we're agnostic to what's actually causing it, and getting it right. On the adaptation thing, I was going to make another point. I forget what it was. Maybe I'll remember it.
Well, I'm heartened to hear that. The one note I have is that the risks of climate change are correlated, right? That because there's warming everywhere, the correlation is really what gets you, and that's why mitigation is. So every mitigation model since Nordhaus started writing about this has adaptation built in. It's always been assumed.
But if you look, for example, at the Green Climate Fund, the original versions of the Green Climate Fund had no provision for adaptation. It was adaptation was sort of an afterthought that has come in because people are like, well, what are we actually going to do right now about worsening storms. Oh, this is the other point I was going to make, is that my skepticism of all these top-down policy solutions of what Washington can do is informed in great measure by the National Flood Insurance Program, which is this huge program that pays people to increase their exposure to severe storms and increase the aggregate amount of property damage that is exposed to severe storms. This is like the lowest hanging fruit in the entire world of climate policy. Everybody understands the problem of and agrees what the problem of the National Flood Insurance Program are. And these people in Congress can't even fix that. So like, excuse me if I don't have a lot of confidence that they can like reorder our entire electricity grid when they can't fix literally the simplest problem in climate policy.
I have a question from online, which I will sort of alter slightly. The question's about climate targets. David, you mentioned the impossibility of 1.5, of 2, and yet you also mentioned the incredible progress we've made in expected warming over the last 15 years. Is it right, is that the right metric for this new age? Is global temperature targets, are they useful? Do they provide a useful guide? Maybe a quick answer from each of you to close out.
No, they're getting in the way. They're also the wrong way to measure progress because governments don't have control over the temperature target. Plus, they're globally average surface air temperatures. So that's particularly wrong. Most of the heat's going to the oceans. If you're going to be doing global target, it should be ocean heat content, which we know how to measure because we have drones that do that. So that whole debate, that's a great example of a debate that just got way off on the wrong track and created a perpetual employment program for academics.
Sarah.
That's great. So, Libby, they were useful for a period of time. They were useful. They motivated a huge amount of policy and a huge amount of investment. And so, good on people who figured out how to, mobilize all of that. I think they are of diminishing value at present because partially for the conversation we just had, which is we have made a huge amount of progress in transitioning the energy system. There is more to be done, but I think it will make greater strides based on all of the competitive value that it provides to economies that employ them and the productivity gains that are going to come from it. I think could be potentially quite useful. So I would be fine if those types of policies carried the day on the mitigation side. I do think to David's point, there's a lot of cathartic right now being we all knew net zero wasn't going to happen. So adaptation. And it's I'm sorry, pay attention. We have been doing adaptation stuff for a long period of time. It is hard. It has as much incentives, mixed incentive systems that are hard to fix on Capitol Hill and in local communities. It's really hard. I think what we're seeing, to our colleague from the E3G perspective, countries are now saying to themselves, you know what, we now have a much cleaner sense of what the cost of transitioning the energy system is and what our own cost benefit analyses are on that. What we think other countries might be willing to do, both in terms of financing that transition and cooperating with us. That's not all a good news story, by the way. Some of it is, but not all of it is. But we also sort of know that as much as we think, having a strong economy that has new industry and all the things I said on the mitigation side that drives competitiveness, if you are not able to adapt and withstand the impacts of climate, you're not a competitive economy. Right. You need to invest in your own adaptive capacity in ways that matter. And I think that is a lot of what's going on in the adaptation space, which is cost-benefit analysis, political economic analysis of what adaptation really matters. I think we all have a knee-jerk reaction to what that is, but when you see companies and institutions employing adaptation measures, there's a whole hierarchy of things that countries are basically saying, I have limited amounts of money. Money is more expensive now. I'm going to have to figure out how to do both sides of this ledger. I just think we have a much broader aperture and more information to engage in those conversations.
We are going to be very willing to protect brunch eaters in Brooklyn, but very willing to sacrifice large swaths of the Southeast.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just want to say,
is the choice Brooklyn versus the Southeast? Okay, we got over drinks, many drinks. We'll have to figure that one out.
So I just want to say one of the reasons why, from just even a basic statistical point of view, the risk assessment on carbon emissions as a pollutant, I believe, points towards adaptation rather than carbon emissions reductions as the primary response is that through all the national climate assessments and all the IPCC, ARs, you've always seen a reported range of values for what scientists call equilibrium climate sensitivity. How much do temperatures increase when you double atmospheric carbon dioxide? That's like a value, right? And scientists don't know what it is. And you've seen in the most recent national climate assessment, they were able to tighten the range, but in the first four national climate assessments, the best guess was that it was somewhere between 2 degrees and like 8 degrees. Okay, so that gives me a piece of information that I knew already before reading any of this, which is that the risk of climate change is somewhere between not much and catastrophic, right? And so if it's somewhere between 2 degrees, that means that the goals of the Paris Agreement are going to get reached without any effort at all. If it's as much as 8 degrees, that's really a catastrophe. And it's somewhere in between. So how do you price a carbon tax on the basis of this information? You can't, because it's somewhere between $100 a ton and $3,000 a ton. And so I think this reveals a conceptual flaw that I think people really need to look at when they look at the National Climate Assessment, which is the way that the National Climate Assessment responds to this variability is by emphasizing the worst case scenario and by really somewhat torturing the data to narrow the band of variability as much as possible. And what you see in the National Climate Assessment very systematically, and it's a very profound conceptual flaw, is extreme risk aversion towards the risk of climate change and extreme risk tolerance toward the risk of the policy response. And this is not a rational approach to cost-benefit analysis. So I'll just say that whether you're going to be risk averse or risk tolerant, it's up to you, but you need to do it on both sides of the equation. Otherwise, your analysis is flawed. And I think that this is something that we'll be fixing in the years ahead in the National Climate Assessment.
So do you mean the risk tolerance of the policy response on mitigation?
The risk tolerance the risk tolerance, right.
I just didn't understand.
There's a sentence in the National Climate Assessment that says the costs of climate change are expected to far outweigh the costs of carbon mitigation, of carbon action. Yeah.
But it's not an either-or choice. You
Yeah.
do both and recognize that when we have these profoundly uncertain variables, the tails have to both have two sides.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
And one of them is also reversible. But this is a conversation for another day. The implication of your statement is global temperature targets are poor because we actually don't know the climate response. And that's actually, I think, that is valid. The carbon budget associated with a 2-degree target varies by hundreds of gigatons of CO2, which is decades of emissions, and that's actually a real challenge for those things. Anyway, we will close here. Colleagues, thank you for joining us. Colleagues online, well, thank you for joining me as well. If you would, with a warm round of applause, thank our panelists. Of course, my pleasure.